The sunrise over Phoenix bathed the city in golden light, highlighting the impressive skyline of luxury hotels and resorts that stretched across the valley. From her corner office on the 40th floor, Elizabeth Morgan surveyed her domain with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built something substantial from nothing. At 45, she carried herself with the understated confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was worth, both in dollars and character. The quarterly report spread across her mahogany desk told a story of unparalleled success. Morgan Hospitality Group, $500 million in assets, 35 luxury properties across 5 southwestern states, and profit margins that made Wall Street veterans envious. All of it built through her strategic vision, relentless work ethic, and an uncanny ability to predict hospitality trends before they materialized. Success isn't about flaunting power, Elizabeth thought as she prepared for the morning's executive board meeting. It's about building a legacy that stands when you're no longer in the room. Her assistant knocked gently before entering, carrying the final revenue projections and acquisition proposals. The board is assembled in the main conference room, Mrs. Morgan. They're eager to hear about the Nevada expansion. Elizabeth nodded, gathering her materials with practiced efficiency. Thank you, Sarah. Let them know I'll be there momentarily. The boardroom fell silent as Elizabeth entered 12 executives in tailored suits, straightening almost imperceptibly in their chairs. She had hired each of them personally over the years, building a team that respected her vision while bringing their own expertise to the table. Good morning, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. Today we're discussing the final phase of our Western expansion strategy. The Las Vegas acquisition represents not just our largest single investment to date, but our entrance into one of the most competitive luxury markets in the country. For the next hour, Elizabeth led the meeting with the precision of a symphony conductor, fielding questions, addressing concerns, and ultimately securing unanimous approval for the $75 million acquisition that would cement Morgan Hospitality as a dominant force in the southwestern luxury market. That's settled then, she concluded, closing her leather portfolio. Marcus, I'll need the final contract revisions by Friday. Jennifer, coordinate with legal on the regulatory filings. We'll reconvene next week to finalize the timeline. As the executives filed out, Marcus Chen, her 52-year-old COO and closest business confidant, lingered behind. Another flawless presentation, he remarked with genuine admiration. The board didn't stand a chance. Elizabeth allowed herself a small smile. The numbers make their own argument. All I did was connect the dots. Marcus leaned against the conference table, studying her with the familiarity of a decade-long professional partnership. And how are things on the home front, James, still adjusting to your new role as the big bad CEO? The question touched a nerve Elizabeth preferred to leave unexplored during business hours. Her husband, James, a moderately successful corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm, had never quite reconciled himself to his wife's extraordinary success. What had begun 15 years ago as supportive encouragement for her little hospitality business had gradually morphed into something more complex as her star rose while his plateaued. James is proud of what we've built, she replied diplomatically, avoiding Marcus's knowing gaze. He just expresses it in his own way. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. They both knew the truth was more complicated. That evening, Elizabeth arrived home to find James already there nursing a scotch in their expansive living room while reviewing case files. Their Scottsdale mansion, with its panoramic mountain views and museum-quality southwestern art collection, represented just a fraction of their wealth, though one would never know it from how James described their circumstances to colleagues and friends. "How was your day?" she asked, slipping off her heels and pouring herself a glass of Cabernet. James looked up, offering the distracted smile that had become increasingly common. "Productive. The Henderson merger is moving forward, though the opposing counsel is being difficult about some of the terms." He closed his laptop. "How about you? Anything interesting with your hotel business?" Your hotel business. The phrase that minimized 15 years of extraordinary achievement to a casual hobby. Elizabeth had learned to let such comments pass, knowing they came from a place James himself might not fully understand. "You finalized the Vegas acquisition today," she said casually, though the deal represented one of her career's crowning achievements. "The Desert Oasis property. We'll begin renovations next month." "That's great, honey," James replied, his tone suggesting he was offering praise for a child's finger painting rather than a multi-million-dollar business transaction. Speaking of family news, my mother called. She wants us over for dinner tomorrow. Apparently, Robert has some big announcement. Elizabeth nodded mentally, rearranging her schedule. Victoria Henderson, her mother-in-law, was a formidable 72-year-old matriarch whose Southern upbringing had instilled in her both impeccable manners and unshakable views on family hierarchy, including the proper role of daughters-in-law. "I'll make it work," Elizabeth replied, though she'd been planning to review the architectural plans for the Vegas property renovation. Family obligations always seemed to take precedence over her professional commitments in the Henderson household, a dynamic she had accepted years ago in the interest of harmony. The following evening found them seated around Victoria's formal dining table with its heirloom china and sterling silver candelabras that had been in the family for generations. Robert James's younger brother at 35 sat beside his girlfriend, Lauren Mitchell, a 32-year-old pediatrician with an Ivy League education and the kind of conventional beauty that the Henderson family had always valued. Victoria presided over the gathering with regal authority, directing the conversation with the skill of a veteran conductor. "Elizabeth, dear, James tells me your little hotel chain is expanding again. How wonderful for you to have such a fulfilling hobby while supporting James's career." Elizabeth took a slow sip of wine, letting the comment wash over her like so many before it. "Thank you, Victoria. The business does keep me busy." James cleared his throat, a gesture Elizabeth recognized as his preparation for making introductions at social gatherings. It was a habit that had once struck her as endearing, but now felt like another small paper cut in a thousand-cut evening. "Actually, Mother Elizabeth just acquired a major property in Las Vegas," he said, managing to sound simultaneously proud and dismissive. "She's quite the entrepreneur with her regional hotels." Regional hotels. The phrase hung in the air as Elizabeth suppressed a smile at the irony. Morgan Hospitality Group owned the exclusive resort where the governor hosted foreign dignitaries, the boutique hotel chain favored by Hollywood celebrities, and the luxury desert retreat where James's own law firm held their annual partners' retreat. All facts he conveniently omitted when describing his wife's occupation. Robert, always the more perceptive of the Henderson brothers, caught Elizabeth's expression and quickly changed the subject. "We actually have some news to share tonight," he announced, taking Lauren's hand. "We're engaged." Exclamations of delight erupted around the table. Victoria clasped her hands in obvious joy while James clapped his brother on the shoulder. Elizabeth offered sincere congratulations, genuinely happy for Robert, who had always treated her with more respect than the rest of the Henderson clan. "We're thinking about a spring wedding," Lauren added, her eyes bright with excitement. "Something elegant but intimate." "Us at the country club, I presume?" Victoria asked, already mentally planning the social event of the season. Robert and Lauren exchanged glances, a silent communication that Elizabeth recognized as the prelude to disappointment. "Actually, Mother," Robert began carefully, "we were hoping for something a bit more special. Lauren has always dreamed of a sunset ceremony at Pinnacle Ridge, followed by a reception at Copper Canyon." Victoria's expression faltered slightly. Pinnacle Ridge Estate was one of Phoenix's most exclusive wedding venues, and Copper Canyon was the city's premier fine dining establishment, both well beyond the reach of a young architect and a pediatrician still paying off medical school loans. "Those are ambitious choices," Victoria replied diplomatically. "Perhaps something more sensible might be appropriate. The country club has served the Henderson family for generations." The conversation deteriorated into increasingly strained budget discussions. Robert made decent money as an architect, but Lauren's student loans and their new mortgage meant funds were tight. Dreams of a luxury wedding venue, gourmet catering, and accommodations for out-of-town guests quickly collided with financial reality. Elizabeth listened quietly, sipping her wine and observing the familiar family dynamic unfold. No one at the table bothered to ask her opinion on wedding venues or costs, despite the fact that she owned and operated dozens of luxury event spaces and had access to the region's top vendors at preferential rates. "We could scale back the guest list," Lauren suggested, disappointment evident in her voice. "Maybe just immediate family and closest friends." "And perhaps a more modest venue," Victoria added gently. "The botanical garden is lovely in spring and much more affordable." Elizabeth watched Robert's expression fall, recognizing the look of a dream slowly deflating against the hard edge of financial constraints. She made a mental calculation. $300,000 would cover everything they had described and more, a sum that represented less than a week of Morgan Hospitality's revenue. As coffee was served, Victoria approached Elizabeth in the kitchen, her composed facade showing rare cracks of genuine concern. Elizabeth, dear, I know this is rather forward of me, but I was wondering if perhaps you might have some connections in the hospitality industry that could help Robert and Lauren. Elizabeth carefully placed the dessert plates on the counter, considering her response. I might be able to arrange something. What did you have in mind? Victoria lowered her voice, glancing toward the dining room to ensure they weren't overheard. Perhaps some discounted services or payment arrangements. They're young and just starting out, but they deserve a beautiful wedding. I could do better than discounts, Elizabeth replied quietly. I could cover the entire cost, but I'd prefer to do it anonymously. I don't want them to feel indebted. Victoria's eyes widened momentarily before her practiced social mask returned. That's extraordinarily generous, Elizabeth. But are you certain it would be a substantial amount? I'm certain, Elizabeth replied simply. Let them have their dream wedding without financial stress. Just keep my involvement between us. Victoria embraced her with uncharacteristic warmth. You're a good person, Elizabeth. The family may not always show it, but we do appreciate you. That night, as James slept beside her, Elizabeth lay awake contemplating her decision. The $300,000 gift represented more than just a financial contribution to a family celebration. It was perhaps a quiet bid for the acceptance and recognition she had never quite received from the Hendersons despite 15 years of marriage. Sometimes the greatest gift is the one given without expectation of acknowledgement or gratitude, she whispered to herself in the darkness, mantra that had guided much of her professional and personal life. The following weeks passed in a blur of wedding preparations and business expansions. Elizabeth quietly arranged for Pinnacle Ridge Estate Copper Canyon Catering and Desert Palms Hotel to provide their services for Robert and Lauren's wedding, all while maintaining her anonymity as the benefactor. Victoria acted as the intermediary, presenting these arrangements as fortuitous discounts she had negotiated through family connections. Elizabeth found a curious satisfaction in orchestrating the perfect wedding from behind the scenes, applying the same strategic approach that had built her business empire. She personally reviewed the menu, selections, floral arrangements, and accommodation details, ensuring that every aspect met her exacting standards while remaining true to Robert and Lauren's vision. The wedding planning seems to be going well, James remarked one evening, leafing through a legal brief. Mother says they've managed to secure Pinnacle Ridge at a fraction of the usual cost. Apparently, the owner is an old family friend. Elizabeth suppressed a smile at the irony. The old family friend was sitting across from him, though neither James nor anyone else in the family had ever bothered to learn the extent of her business holdings. That's wonderful. Robert and Lauren deserve a beautiful celebration. It's remarkable how these things work out. James continued, oblivious to his wife's amusement. Mother always knows someone who knows someone. 3 weeks before the wedding, Elizabeth was reviewing acquisition documents in her office when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed Julie Wright Evergreen Events, the exclusive event planning company that Morgan Hospitality had acquired 5 years earlier, and which was coordinating Robert and Lauren's wedding under Elizabeth's discreet direction. Elizabeth Morgan, she answered, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she continued reviewing the contract before her. Mrs. Morgan, Julie's voice carried an unusual tension. I'm calling about the Henderson-Mitchell wedding scheduled for next month at Pinnacle Ridge Estate. We've received some concerning instructions that I felt obligated to bring directly to your attention. Elizabeth set down her pen, giving the conversation her full attention. What kind of instructions? Julie hesitated before continuing, professional composure barely masking her discomfort. Yesterday, we received a call from James Morgan. He requested that we remove your name from all guest lists, seating arrangements, and formal announcements, while maintaining all existing financial arrangements exactly as originally established. The words landed with precision, each one a small blade slipping between Elizabeth's ribs. I'm sorry, could you clarify? My husband asked to have me removed from the wedding guest list. Yes, Mrs. Morgan. He was very specific about maintaining all services and accommodations as planned, but instructed us to proceed as though you would not be in attendance. Julie's discomfort was palpable even through the phone line. In 15 years of event planning, I've never encountered a situation where the primary financial contributor was excluded while their funding remained in place. Our team feels extremely uncomfortable proceeding under these circumstances without your direct confirmation. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the phone as the implications crystallized. James had systematically removed her from Frank's wedding celebration while ensuring her $300,000 funding remained intact. The audacity of keeping her money while erasing her presence revealed a calculated betrayal that went beyond simple family drama. "When exactly did my husband contact you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice maintaining the professional composure that had served her through decades of difficult negotiations. "Yesterday afternoon around 3 o'clock, Julie replied. "He presented this as a mutual family decision to avoid potential conflicts during the celebration. He assured us you had agreed to maintain financial support while stepping back from active participation." Elizabeth's phone buzzed with an incoming text. James's name appeared on the screen with a preview that made her stomach clench. "Stop being dramatic. You're not coming to Robert's wedding. We're keeping the money since you offered it as a gift. We'll discuss when you've calmed down." The casual cruelty took her breath away. 15 years of marriage reduced to a text message that treated her like an inconvenient child whose legitimate concerns required patient management. The dismissive tone revealed how James truly perceived her, not as his business-owning wife whose success funded their lifestyle, but as an emotional woman whose legitimate anger represented mere hysteria requiring correction. "Mrs. Morgan, are you still there?" Julie's voice pulled her attention back to the phone call. "Yes, I apologize," Elizabeth replied, her mind racing. "Please continue." "I wanted to ask directly whether you consent to these arrangements. Our standard contracts include clauses protecting financial contributors from unauthorized changes to event coordination. And frankly, this situation appears to violate several industry ethical guidelines." Elizabeth's phone buzzed again with another message from James. "Teresa called crying about vendor issues. Fix this mess you created. Robert doesn't need his wedding ruined because you can't handle family decisions like an adult." The victim blaming reached new depths of manipulation. James was now positioning Elizabeth as responsible for chaos created by his own betrayal, while characterizing his theft and humiliation as family decisions that reasonable people should accept without complaint. "Julie, I need to ask you something directly," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Has my husband contacted any other vendors associated with the wedding with similar instructions?" A pause. "Yes, Mrs. Morgan. We've received calls from several vendors expressing similar concerns. Copper Canyon Catering was instructed to modify menu selections without consulting the financial contributor. Desert Palms Hotel was directed to adjust guest accommodation arrangements while maintaining the existing billing structure." The conspiracy extended far beyond James's initial betrayal. He had contacted every vendor associated with Robert's wedding, systematically erasing Elizabeth's involvement while preserving her financial obligations. The audacity of coordinating such extensive deception while characterizing her objections as drama revealed a level of manipulation she had never suspected him capable of achieving. "There was something else you should know," Julie continued hesitantly. "Your husband mentioned these changes were necessary because of your tendency toward emotional instability during family events. He suggested your presence might create uncomfortable situations for other guests." James had assassinated her character to justify her exclusion, painting her as an unstable woman whose emotional problems required family management. The man who had benefited from her business success for 15 years was now portraying her as mentally unfit to attend social gatherings, creating a narrative that positioned her exclusion as protective rather than punitive. Elizabeth's reflection in the office window showed a woman whose professional composure was beginning to fracture under the weight of systematic betrayal. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her options, a rare physical manifestation of the emotional earthquake rippling through her carefully constructed world. "Julie, thank you for bringing this to my attention," Elizabeth said finally, her decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "Please maintain all existing arrangements for now. I'll handle this situation personally and get back to you with further instructions." After ending the call, Elizabeth remained seated in her office sanctuary surrounded by tangible evidence of achievements James's family had never bothered to understand. The Waterford crystal service she had purchased to celebrate acquiring her 10th luxury property gleamed in the afternoon light. Original Southwestern artwork, worth more than most people's annual salaries, decorated walls that had witnessed deals that shaped the hospitality industry across multiple states. The phone rang again barely 30 minutes later. The display showed Victoria Henderson's name, an unexpected development that stirred Elizabeth's curiosity despite her instinct to avoid further pain. "Elizabeth, thank goodness you answered." Victoria began, her voice carrying an unusual tremor. "There seems to be some confusion with the wedding arrangements. The event planner called me quite distressed about conflicting instructions." "Is there confusion, Victoria?" Elizabeth kept her tone neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Or is there a coordinated effort to exclude me from a wedding I'm funding entirely?" A lengthy pause followed. "Elizabeth, dear, you must understand, we're trying to protect everyone involved." James explained how stressed you've been with work, how family gatherings have been overwhelming for you lately. "We thought if we handled the details, you could avoid all the planning pressure." The explanation sounded rehearsed, each word carefully chosen to reframe betrayal as benevolence. Victoria spoke with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent considerable time crafting this narrative, likely with James's guidance and input from other family members. "Victoria, I was removed from the guest list entirely. How does that qualify as protecting me from planning pressure?" "Well, that part became complicated." Victoria's voice wavered slightly, the first crack in her prepared script. "There are certain family dynamics at play that might create tension. You know how emotional these events can become, and we wanted everything focused on Robert and Lauren's happiness." The euphemisms continued piling up like defensive barriers. Family dynamics replaced the truth of their coordinated exclusion. Emotional characterized Elizabeth's anticipated reaction to theft and humiliation as unreasonable female hysteria. Robert and Lauren's happiness positioned her presence as somehow threatening to the couple's joy. "Victoria, whose idea was it to remove me from the guest list?" Another pause, longer this time. "It was a family decision. We all discussed it thoroughly and agreed this approach would be best for everyone concerned." They had held family meetings about her exclusion. Multiple conversations where the Hendersons sat around discussing whether the woman funding their celebration deserved to attend it. The systematic nature of this betrayal cut deeper than any spontaneous cruelty could have achieved. "Including Robert," Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. "Robert wants whatever creates the most harmonious environment for his special day. He's grateful for your support and doesn't want any conflicts to overshadow the celebration." Robert's silence became a betrayal unto itself. Hours had passed since the wedding vendors contacted him about the chaos surrounding his wedding, yet he had not called to express concern, confusion, or gratitude. The man whose wedding Elizabeth had funded completely now hid behind family spokespeople rather than addressing the situation directly. Elizabeth ended the call with Victoria, her mind already formulating a response that matched the calculated nature of the family's betrayal. The empire she had built as armor against the world's cruelties felt suddenly essential when the people she trusted most had casually decided she was disposable. When Robert finally called 20 minutes later, his tone carried the weary obligation of someone completing an unpleasant task rather than the genuine emotion of someone whose dreams had been made possible by family generosity. "Elizabeth wanted to personally thank you for your incredible generosity with the wedding expenses." He began, his words sounding formal, almost scripted. "Your support means everything to Lauren and me, and we want you to know how much we appreciate your understanding about the guest list situation." "My understanding?" The phrase escaped before Elizabeth could moderate her response. "Robert, I found out about my exclusion from your wedding through vendor phone calls." "What exactly am I supposed to understand?" "Well, the family thought it might be better to keep things smaller, more intimate. You know how these events can get complicated when there are too many personalities involved." Robert was using the same euphemistic language Victoria had employed, referring to Elizabeth's presence as a personality problem, rather than acknowledging his family's calculated betrayal. The man she had considered a genuine friend was revealed as someone who lacked the courage to defend basic decency when family pressure mounted. "Robert, I funded your entire wedding. Does that reality factor into your understanding of appropriate guest list decisions?" His uncomfortable laughter revealed everything about his moral framework. Elizabeth, you offered that money as a gift. We're incredibly grateful, but gifts don't come with strings attached, right? The man whose architectural career was built on structural integrity could not recognize the ethical foundation supporting his own wedding celebration. He had transformed Elizabeth's anonymous generosity into an obligation-free windfall that absolved him of any responsibility toward the benefactor. James's arrival home that evening brought the final confirmation of how completely Elizabeth's family relationships had disintegrated. Instead of apologies or explanations, he entered their kitchen with the aggressive defensiveness of someone who believed his position was morally justified. I hope you're satisfied with the chaos you've created, he said, dropping his briefcase with unusual force and glaring at Elizabeth with undisguised resentment. Victoria spent the afternoon crying because vendors are asking inappropriate questions about family decisions. The victim blaming reached breathtaking heights. James was positioning Elizabeth as responsible for vendor confusion created by his own deceptive instructions, while characterizing professional inquiries about irregular financial arrangements as inappropriate questions. You orchestrated my exclusion from Robert's wedding while keeping my money, James. The chaos was created by your betrayal, not my reaction to it. Betrayal, his voice rose with genuine indignation. I was trying to prevent family drama and protect Robert's special day. Your success has made you arrogant, Elizabeth. You think funding something gives you the right to control everything about it. The accusation revealed the deeper resentment that had probably festered throughout their marriage. James had watched Elizabeth's business achievements with growing bitterness, interpreting her success as arrogance rather than recognizing the dedication and intelligence that built Morgan Hospitality. This wedding exclusion wasn't about family harmony, but about diminishing a wife whose accomplishments threatened his ego. 15 years of supporting your career, funding our lifestyle, and accepting your family's dismissive treatment. And you think I'm the arrogant one. Elizabeth's voice remained low, but carried an intensity that made James take a step back. You see, this is exactly the kind of emotional reaction we were trying to avoid at the wedding. Robert doesn't need his celebration ruined by your need to be the center of attention. James was rewriting their marriage history in real time, transforming years of Elizabeth's quiet support and acceptance into attention-seeking behavior that justified his family's coordinated betrayal. The man who had benefited daily from her success now painted her as a narcissist whose presence would ruin celebrations funded by her own generosity. That night, lying in their king-size bed, while James slept peacefully beside her, Elizabeth confronted the devastating loneliness that follows betrayal by those we trust most completely. The silence stretched between them like an ocean filled with 15 years of shared memories that now felt like elaborate deceptions. Her business empire, her financial independence, her reputation for integrity throughout the hospitality industry. None of these achievements mattered when facing the hollow recognition that her own family had secretly planned her exclusion while depending on her continued generosity. She had spent 15 years building bridges to people who were quietly preparing to burn them the moment she became inconvenient rather than useful. The darkness of their bedroom echoed with conversations she would never have, again family gatherings where she would never feel welcomed, and the recognition that love she had believed unconditional was actually contingent on her continued invisibility and financial accessibility. Morning brought no relief from the emotional devastation of the previous night. Elizabeth woke to find James already gone, having left earlier than usual without explanation or goodbye. The emptiness of their kitchen felt different now, charged with the knowledge that the man she had shared coffee with for 15 years viewed her as an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Victoria, along with a voicemail that carried the carefully modulated tone reserved for family crises requiring diplomatic intervention. Elizabeth poured coffee into her favorite mug, the one James had given her for their 5th anniversary, and prepared herself for what would undoubtedly be another exercise in family damage control. Elizabeth, darling, I hope you understand that family situations can become quite complicated. Victoria's recorded voice flowed with practiced smoothness. James mentioned there were some concerns about the wedding arrangements, and I wanted you to know that we all appreciate your generous contribution. Perhaps it would be best if we simply let bygones be bygones and focused on Robert's happiness. These sorts of misunderstandings tend to resolve themselves when everyone keeps the bigger picture in mind. The carefully chosen phrases revealed how thoroughly James had briefed his family about containing Elizabeth's reaction to their betrayal. Victoria spoke as if witnessing a minor disagreement between children rather than addressing the systematic theft and humiliation orchestrated by her son. Her suggestion to let bygones be bygones positioned Elizabeth's legitimate outrage as petty grievance-keeping that mature adults should abandon for the sake of family harmony. James's sister Catherine called within the hour, her approach slightly different but equally manipulative in its underlying assumption that Elizabeth's reaction was disproportionate to the offense committed. Elizabeth Brichneau family dynamics can be really challenging sometimes, Catherine began, with the patronizing sympathy she typically reserved for discussing difficult relatives. James explained that there were some tensions around the wedding planning, and honestly, these big events tend to bring out the worst in everyone. Maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise that lets you avoid all that wedding stress. The reframing continued with stunning audacity. Catherine was characterizing Elizabeth's exclusion from Robert's wedding as a fortunate escape from unpleasant obligations, rather than acknowledging the betrayal of trust and theft of money that had actually occurred. Her tone suggested that reasonable people would feel grateful for being spared the burden of attending celebrations they had funded. You know how emotional these occasions can get, especially when there are a lot of strong personalities involved. She continued, her voice carrying the subtle implication that Elizabeth represented one of those problematic personalities requiring management. Robert and Lauren just want their day to be perfect, and sometimes that means making difficult choices about guest dynamics. Each family member who called employed variations of the same strategy. Elizabeth's exclusion became protection from stress. Her financial contribution became a generous gift that should require no reciprocal consideration. Her anger became emotional instability that threatened family celebrations. The sophistication of their coordinated response revealed extensive planning and consultation among James's relatives. The most disturbing call came from Lauren herself, Robert's fiancée, who demonstrated a level of calculated manipulation that suggested natural talent rather than coached behavior. Her voice carried precisely the right blend of innocence and gratitude to deflect responsibility while maintaining plausible deniability about her role in the conspiracy. Elizabeth, I wanted to personally thank you for being so understanding about the wedding arrangements. Lauren began with perfectly modulated warmth. I know these family events can get complicated, and your willingness to prioritize Robert's happiness over any personal concerns really shows what kind of person you are. The performance was flawless. Lauren managed to thank Elizabeth for understanding decisions she had never consented to while positioning her exclusion as evidence of her noble character rather than acknowledging the betrayal that had actually occurred. She spoke as if Elizabeth had voluntarily withdrawn from the celebration rather than being systematically erased by family conspiracy. Robert is so grateful for your generosity with the wedding expenses. She continued, her tone carrying just enough emotional weight to seem genuine without acknowledging the ethical implications of accepting money from someone they had excluded. He keeps saying how lucky we are to have family members who care more about our happiness than their own recognition. The subtle dig at Elizabeth's supposed need for recognition revealed how thoroughly James had briefed his future sister-in-law about her character flaws. Lauren was implying that Elizabeth's objection to theft and humiliation stemmed from wounded vanity rather than legitimate outrage at betrayal. She had transformed Elizabeth's anonymous generosity into evidence of attention-seeking behavior that justified their coordinated exclusion. In stark contrast to the family betrayal, Elizabeth's business relationships proved their worth through unwavering professionalism and loyalty. Her assistant spent hours discreetly investigating the vendor connections, mapping the web of companies that ultimately traced back to Morgan Hospitality's various holdings. Her legal team reviewed contract obligations with the thoroughness she had come to expect from professionals who understood their reputations depended on competent service. Most telling was the response from Marcus Chen, her closest business partner, and the man who had helped structure some of Morgan Hospitality's most complex acquisitions. When Elizabeth explained the situation during their regularly scheduled call, his reaction carried none of the diplomatic equivocation that characterized her family's responses. Elizabeth, that's completely unacceptable behavior, Marcus said without hesitation. I don't care what family dynamics were involved. You don't take someone's money and then exclude them from the event. That's fraud, plain and simple. His straightforward moral clarity highlighted the twisted ethical framework her family had adopted to justify their actions. The people Elizabeth paid for professional services demonstrated more integrity and loyalty than blood relatives who had benefited from her generosity for years. Have you considered that this might be strategic rather than merely cruel? Marcus continued his business acumen, cutting through the emotional confusion that family betrayal creates. Excluding you while keeping your funding sends a very specific message about your place in their hierarchy. I am lost by your monarchy. You're valuable for resources but not worthy of inclusion in celebrations. His analysis illuminated what Elizabeth had been struggling to understand. This was not random cruelty or impulsive family drama, but calculated degradation designed to establish permanent boundaries. They were teaching her that she could fund their happiness, but should never expect to share in it. The sophistication of their emotional manipulation revealed years of resentment and planning she had never recognized. The pattern became clear as additional family members contacted Elizabeth throughout the week. Each conversation followed the same script. Her exclusion became in protection. Her funding became generous gifting that required no reciprocal consideration. Her anger became emotional instability that reasonable people should ignore for the sake of family harmony. They had all known about the plan. James's parents, his siblings, even distant relatives who rarely involved themselves in family affairs, had been consulted about Elizabeth's exclusion while her funding was preserved. The entire extended family had participated in deciding that she was expendable, that her contributions were welcome, while her presence was problematic. The realization settled over Elizabeth like cold water. She had spent 15 years believing she was building relationships with people who valued her presence in their lives. Instead, she had been cultivating dependencies among people who viewed her as a convenient resource to be managed and manipulated according to their needs. The network of deception extended far beyond James's impulsive betrayal. This was systematic exclusion coordinated by an entire family who had decided that her money was welcome while her company was not. The revelation of systematic family betrayal demanded a response that matched its calculated cruelty. Elizabeth spent that evening in her home office, surrounded by 15 years of acquisition documents, corporate filings, and subsidiary records that told the story of Morgan Hospitality's expansion across the southwestern United States. Her legal team worked remotely through the night, mapping connections she had never considered in their totality. What emerged from their investigation transformed her understanding of the power she had unconsciously accumulated. Evergreen Events operated under the umbrella of Southwest Event Solutions, which Morgan Hospitality had acquired 3 years earlier during their bankruptcy proceedings. Pinnacle Ridge Estate, the venue Robert and Lauren had selected for its breathtaking desert views, belonged to her hospitality division through a holding company that managed 12 similar properties. Copper Canyon Catering answered to Morgan Hospitality through a subsidiary structure so complex that even industry insiders rarely traced the ultimate ownership. Most significantly, Desert Palms Hotel, where all 60 wedding guests had confirmed reservations, represented the crown jewel of her hotel portfolio, a property she had purchased and renovated into one of Phoenix's most sought-after luxury destinations. Every vendor, every service provider, every aspect of Robert's celebration connected directly to companies Elizabeth controlled through strategic acquisitions that had seemed routine at the time, but now revealed themselves as instruments of unprecedented leverage. The family who had dismissed her business as Elizabeth's little hotel hobby had unknowingly constructed their entire wedding celebration on the foundation of her corporate empire. They had insulted and excluded the woman who literally owned every component of their dream celebration. Elizabeth's phone call to Julie Wright the following morning carried an authority she had never exercised with such focused precision. When she identified herself as the ultimate owner of Evergreen Events, the silence that followed stretched long enough for Elizabeth to hear Julie's sharp intake of breath. "Mrs. Morgan, I had no idea." Julie managed finally, her voice carrying the particular strain that comes from realizing you have been operating under completely false assumptions about power dynamics. "The corporate structure is so complex, and your husband never mentioned." "My husband has no involvement in Morgan Hospitality's business operations." Elizabeth interrupted with the cold precision that had built her empire through hostile negotiations. He has also demonstrated a concerning tendency to misrepresent both his authority and my consent regarding family financial matters. Julie's professional composure began crumbling as the implications of her situation became clear. She had accepted instructions from a man who possessed no authority over companies he did not own, while dismissing concerns from the woman who controlled every aspect of the wedding infrastructure. I need you to understand something very clearly, Julie. Elizabeth continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her professional trademark. When my husband contacted you about excluding me from the Henderson-Mitchell wedding while preserving my financial contributions, he was exceeding any authority he has ever possessed. Those instructions violated both our professional agreements and basic business ethics. Mrs. Morgan, if I had known about the ownership structure, I would never have accepted those instructions, Julie replied, desperation evident in her voice. Our standard procedures require authorization from primary stakeholders for any significant changes to event coordination. Her response highlighted how completely James had underestimated both Elizabeth's business acumen and her industry relationships. He had assumed he could manipulate vendors who ultimately answered to her, dismissing the possibility that his quiet wife might command respect and loyalty throughout the hospitality sector. Julie, I want you to contact every vendor associated with the Henderson-Mitchell wedding and inform them that their services are no longer required. All contracts should be terminated immediately and all reservations should be canceled. The silence that followed carried the weight of a woman realizing she was witnessing the systematic dismantling of months of careful planning. Mrs. Morgan, are you certain about this decision? The wedding is scheduled for next month, and finding replacement services will be virtually impossible on such short notice. I am completely certain, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. My family made a business decision to exclude me while retaining my funding. Now they will learn what happens when you betray someone who controls the entire industry infrastructure you depend upon. The cancellation process unfolded with surgical precision. Over the following hours, each vendor received official notice that their services were no longer required for the Henderson-Mitchell celebration. Every contract was legally terminated according to the clauses Elizabeth's legal team had crafted years earlier to protect Morgan Hospitality's interests. Each hotel reservation was canceled, each catering arrangement was dissolved, and each venue booking was eliminated from the system. Elizabeth did not act from emotional impulse or desire for petty revenge. This was the calculated response that had built her empire through strategic thinking and consequences for those who violated business relationships. Robert and Lauren had made a choice to participate in her humiliation while benefiting from her generosity. Now they would discover that choices carry consequences, especially when you betray someone who controls the infrastructure your dreams depend upon. The power Elizabeth wielded in this moment felt different from anything she had experienced during 15 years of marriage. For decades, she had accepted dismissive treatment from James's family, funded their various needs and desires, while remaining invisible, and prioritized their comfort over her own recognition and respect. She had played the role of the quiet, accommodating family member while building an empire that dwarfed their comprehension. But now, for the first time in her marriage, she felt the pure intoxication of exercising power without apology or restraint. The family that had casually discarded her while keeping her money was about to learn that the quiet woman they had underestimated held every card in this particular game. Years of accepting minimal recognition while providing maximum support suddenly seemed like strategic patience rather than virtuous self-sacrifice. Elizabeth stood before her bathroom mirror that evening, studying the face of a woman who had allowed herself to be diminished for far too long. 15 years of silence, she whispered to her reflection. That ends today. Her assistant entered her office the next morning with updates on the cancellation process, her expression carrying the mixture of professional efficiency and personal concern that characterized their working relationship. Mrs. Morgan, all vendor notifications have been completed. Several companies have requested confirmation of these instructions given the unusual circumstances and short timeline. Tell them that Morgan Hospitality's decision is final and non-negotiable, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. Any vendor who cannot accept these instructions should review their contractual obligations regarding parent company directives. The cascade of consequences began within hours. Robert and Lauren would receive calls from confused vendors explaining that their services were no longer available. Hotel reservations would disappear from the system. Catering arrangements would be dissolved, and the venue booking that had seemed secure would evaporate without explanation. The celebration they had planned for months would disintegrate in a single afternoon because they had chosen to betray the woman who unknowingly controlled every component of their wedding infrastructure. The first call came just before noon. Elizabeth's office phone lit up with Victoria's number. She let it ring 3 times before answering, savoring the anticipation of the confusion and panic that would be evident in her mother-in-law's voice. "Elizabeth, something terrible is happening," Victoria began without preamble, her voice higher-pitched and breathless with the kind of desperation that accompanies watching carefully constructed plans disintegrate in real time. "Every single vendor has called to cancel their services. The venue, the caterer, the hotel reservations, everything is gone." Elizabeth maintained professional composure while noting the delicious irony that Victoria was calling the woman they had excluded for help with problems created by that very exclusion. "That sounds extremely concerning, Victoria. Have the vendors provided any explanation for these cancellations?" "They all claim it's due to corporate policy changes or parent company directives, but none of it makes sense. We signed contracts months ago, paid deposits, confirmed everything multiple times. How can they just cancel with no warning?" Her bewilderment was complete and satisfying. Victoria had no concept that the woman she had helped betray actually controlled every vendor she was desperately trying to retain. The tears in her voice, which had once moved Elizabeth to write generous checks, now sounded like justice being served with a mathematical precision. "Have you tried contacting alternative vendors?" Elizabeth asked with the helpful tone she had always employed during family crises, though this time her assistance would prove remarkably limited. "That's the impossible part," Victoria replied, her voice cracking with stress. "Every decent venue in the Phoenix area is suddenly booked solid. Every quality caterer claims they have no availability. Every hotel we've called shows no vacancy for our dates. It's like the entire industry coordinated to shut us out." The accuracy of her assessment was remarkable. The industry had indeed coordinated to shut them out, though she remained oblivious to the coordinator's identity. Elizabeth's 15 years of strategic acquisitions had created a network so comprehensive that finding alternatives required looking beyond the quality standards Robert and Lauren had originally established for their celebration. "I've been calling for 6 straight hours," Victoria continued, her voice breaking with exhaustion and frustration. "I even tried vendors in Tucson and Flagstaff, but they're either booked or unwilling to travel for our date. I don't understand what's happening." Robert's call came 20 minutes later, his architectural training evident in his methodical approach to problem solving, though his logic proved useless against the reality of Elizabeth's market dominance. Unlike Victoria's emotional pleading, Robert attempted to analyze the situation with professional detachment that gradually crumbled as the scope of the disaster became apparent. "Elizabeth, I need to ask you something directly." Robert began with the measured tone he used for client consultations. "Do you have any idea why every vendor associated with our wedding would suddenly cancel their services on the same day?" "That does seem like an unusual coincidence," Elizabeth replied, maintaining the helpful family member persona that had served her well for 15 years. "Have you considered whether someone with significant industry influence might have reasons for these actions?" The pause that followed stretched long enough for Elizabeth to hear him processing the implications of her suggestion. Robert was intelligent enough to recognize that such coordinated cancellations required substantial power and organization, though he had not yet connected these requirements to his quiet sister-in-law, who supposedly ran a small hotel business. "Are you suggesting that someone is deliberately sabotaging our wedding?" His voice carried growing alarm as the possibility of intentional interference replaced his initial assumption of unfortunate coincidence. "Who would have both the motivation and the capability to coordinate something like this?" "I wouldn't want to speculate about motivations," Elizabeth said carefully, "but the capability part is interesting. This level of coordination would require someone with extensive connections throughout the hospitality industry, someone whose influence extends across multiple vendor categories." Robert's silence suggested he was beginning to understand that his wedding had been targeted by someone with resources and reach far beyond typical family drama. The man who designed buildings was finally grasping that his celebration had been systematically demolished by an architect of consequences he had never bothered to acknowledge. James's response proved far less analytical and infinitely more revealing about his true character when faced with situations beyond his control. His calls began with the dismissive authority he had always employed when Elizabeth's business activities inconvenienced his family plans, but his tone shifted rapidly as he realized that his usual tactics would prove inadequate for this crisis. "Elizabeth, you need to fix this mess immediately," James commanded. During his first call, his voice carrying the entitled assumption that she would naturally prioritize solving problems created by his betrayal. Robert is in full panic mode, and Victoria hasn't stopped crying for hours. Whatever game you're playing needs to stop right now. The casual characterization of systematic consequences as games revealed how completely James misunderstood both the situation and Elizabeth's response to his orchestrated humiliation. He genuinely believed that his wife's reaction to theft and betrayal represented childish behavior that reasonable adults should ignore rather than recognizing it as the calculated exercise of legitimate power. "I'm not playing any games, James. I'm simply allowing natural consequences to unfold when people make choices about betraying family members who have been generous with them." "Natural consequences," his voice rose with genuine indignation. "You're destroying Robert's wedding out of spite because your feelings got hurt. This is exactly the kind of emotional instability we were trying to avoid by keeping you away from the celebration." The victim blaming reached stunning heights as James transformed his theft and betrayal into evidence of Elizabeth's mental health problems. He had orchestrated her exclusion while stealing her money, then characterized her response as proof that his original decision was justified. The circular logic would have been impressive if it weren't so morally bankrupt. "James, you excluded me from a wedding I funded completely while keeping my $300,000. If you can explain how that represents reasonable family behavior, I'm willing to listen." "You offered that money as a gift, Elizabeth. Gifts don't come with strings attached, and they don't give you the right to control other people's celebrations. Your success has made you think you can buy your way into situations where you're not wanted." The accusation revealed resentments that had probably festered throughout their marriage. James viewed Elizabeth's business achievements as arrogance rather than recognizing the dedication and intelligence that built Morgan Hospitality from nothing into a regional empire. This wedding crisis was not about family harmony, but about diminishing a wife whose success threatened his ego and challenged his assumptions about domestic power dynamics. Within 48 hours, word began spreading through Phoenix's hospitality community that Elizabeth Morgan was exercising the full scope of her considerable influence. Vendors who had treated her with routine professionalism suddenly understood they had been dealing with industry royalty, whose quiet demeanor had masked unprecedented market control. Competitors who had underestimated Morgan Hospitality began reassessing their strategic positions and their relationship strategies with someone they had not realized was a major power broker. Her assistant fielded calls from industry colleagues seeking to understand the implications of the Henderson Mitchell cancellations for their own business relationships. Hotel managers who had accepted routine booking requests now recognized they had been dealing with the owner of competing properties. Catering companies that had viewed Morgan Hospitality as another regional player suddenly understood they were operating in markets dominated by a competitor whose influence they had never recognized. The quiet woman who had preferred anonymous generosity was revealing the true scope of her empire, and the entire southwestern hospitality industry was taking notice of power they had never bothered to acknowledge or respect. Elizabeth's reputation was transforming from successful businesswoman to force of nature, and the recognition felt intoxicating after decades of accepting invisibility in both professional and personal relationships. The chaos surrounding Robert's wedding represented just the beginning of consequences that would reshape how everyone involved understood power loyalty and the cost of betraying someone whose influence extended far beyond their comprehension. Elizabeth drove to her office early the next morning, slipping through the side entrance to avoid the growing contingent of industry professionals seeking meetings with the woman whose influence they had only recently recognized. Her executive suite on the 40th floor provided sanctuary, while also offering the panoramic views that reminded her daily of the empire she had built through strategic vision and relentless determination. Marcus arrived shortly after 9, carrying the expansion plans they had scheduled to discuss weeks earlier, before family betrayal had temporarily diverted her attention from business growth. "I take it from the industry panic that your message has been received," he remarked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Elizabeth nodded, her expression betraying a small measure of the satisfaction she felt. "The vendors have all complied with cancellation directives. Victoria reports complete inability to secure alternative arrangements." Marcus leaned forward, studying her with the careful assessment of someone who had witnessed her strategic brilliance in countless business negotiations. "Have you considered that this might be more than just a family dispute? What you're experiencing represents a pattern, not an isolated incident." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked, though part of her already understood where this conversation was heading. "I've observed the Henderson family dynamic for over a decade," Marcus replied, choosing his words with characteristic precision. "They consistently minimize your achievements while benefiting from your success. They accept your financial support while excluding you from meaningful participation. This wedding situation isn't an anomaly. It's the culmination of a long-established pattern." Elizabeth considered his assessment, recognizing the truth in his analysis. The wedding exclusion wasn't a spontaneous family decision, but the natural progression of dynamics that had been building throughout her 15-year marriage. James's family had always treated her contributions as entitlements, while viewing her presence as optional at best and problematic at worst. "What would you suggest?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Marcus hesitated, weighing professional advice against personal concern for a colleague he genuinely respected. "Elizabeth, sometimes a storm is necessary for people to appreciate the shelter they've taken for granted. Your family needs to understand that your generosity has been a choice, not an obligation, and choices can change when relationships change." His metaphor resonated with something deep within Elizabeth's understanding of her situation. She had allowed her family to take shelter in her success without acknowledging the source of their protection. Now perhaps it was time for them to experience the full force of the storm that came from betraying someone whose generosity they had mistaken for weakness. "Thank you, Marcus," she said quietly. "I think I know what needs to happen next." After he left, Elizabeth called her executive team together for an emergency strategy session. As they filed into her conference room, department heads, legal advisors, and operational directors, Elizabeth recognized that this meeting represented a turning point in how she would manage both her business and her personal relationships moving forward. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, as the team settled around the massive conference table. "I've called you here to discuss a situation that bridges both personal and professional considerations." For the next hour, Elizabeth outlined the Henderson-Mitchell wedding situation in precise detail, including her anonymous financial contribution, the family's coordinated decision to exclude her while keeping her funding, and her subsequent cancellation of all vendor services. She excluded nothing, understanding that transparency with her executive team would be essential for their continued trust and cooperation. "What many of you may not realize," she continued, "is that this situation represents just one example of a pattern that has persisted throughout my marriage. The Henderson family has consistently benefited from Morgan Hospitality's success while minimizing my contributions and treating my presence as optional rather than essential." Her team listened with the focused attention that had helped build their corporate culture, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested this information confirmed suspicion some had harbored for years. "I've always maintained strict separation between my personal relationships and our business operations," Elizabeth acknowledged. "However, the situation demonstrates that such separation becomes problematic when family members attempt to exploit corporate resources without understanding their connections to our overall structure." Elizabeth's CFO, Jennifer Walters, spoke first after the presentation concluded. "Mrs. Morgan, from a purely financial perspective, your anonymous contribution to the Henderson-Mitchell wedding represented a significant personal gift rather than a corporate expenditure. However, the subsequent actions by family members to exclude you while retaining your funding could potentially create precedents that might impact shareholder perception of management boundaries." The corporate lawyer David Greenspan nodded in agreement. There are also ethical considerations regarding attempted manipulation of vendor relationships by individuals with no official standing in our corporate structure. Mr. Morgan's representations to our subsidiary companies created potential liability issues that warranted immediate correction. One by one, each executive offered analysis from their specific area of expertise, collectively building the case that Elizabeth's cancellation of wedding services represented not emotional retaliation, but necessary protection of corporate interests and governance structures. The validation from her professional team reinforced her conviction that the boundaries she was establishing were both reasonable and overdue. Moving forward, Elizabeth concluded, I'll need each department to review vendor relationships and contractual obligations to ensure clear understanding of authorization hierarchies. The situation we've encountered may recur in different forms, and I want our corporate structure fully protected against unauthorized interference, regardless of personal connections. As the meeting adjourned, her team departed with a new understanding of their CEO. Not just as a brilliant business strategist, but as someone who had maintained professional excellence despite personal challenges that would have derailed less determined individuals. The respect in their expressions had deepened, transforming from professional admiration to personal loyalty in ways Elizabeth had never actively sought, but now recognized as essential for the next phase of both her career and her life. Alone in her office after the meeting, Elizabeth contemplated her next move. The cancellation of wedding services had delivered an unmistakable message about consequences, but she recognized that true resolution would require direct confrontation rather than continued remote manipulation of circumstances. The Henderson family needed to understand not just the reach of her power, but the reasons for its exercise, not just what she could do, but why she had chosen this particular response to their betrayal. Elizabeth picked up her phone and called her assistant. Sarah, I need you to arrange a meeting for tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. in the main conference room. Please send formal invitations to James Morgan Victoria and Harold Henderson, Robert Henderson, Lauren Mitchell, and Catherine Henderson. The subject line should read, Urgent Discussion of Henderson-Mitchell Wedding Arrangements. Of course, Mrs. Morgan, her assistant replied with professional efficiency that masked any curiosity about this unusual gathering of the CEO's family members. Will there be any special arrangements for the meeting? Yes, Elizabeth confirmed her decision, crystallizing as she spoke. Have the legal department prepare comprehensive documentation of Morgan Hospitality's ownership structure, with particular emphasis on our events division, luxury venues, catering services, and hotel properties. I want detailed organization charts showing the connections between our subsidiaries and the vendors originally contracted for the Henderson-Mitchell wedding. And for catering, Sarah inquired, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. Coffee service only, Elizabeth replied. This isn't a social gathering. That evening, Elizabeth returned to the mansion she shared with James, finding him in the kitchen on his third scotch, surrounded by legal briefs he was clearly too distracted to properly review. His expression when she entered combined defiance with uncertainty, the look of someone who had deployed his most effective weapons only to discover they had strengthened rather than weakened his opponent. Victoria called again, he began without greeting, his voice carrying the edge that came from hours of fielding family complaints. She says every venue within 200 miles is mysteriously unavailable. Robert can't even get a return call from caterers who were begging for his businesses last month. Elizabeth set her briefcase on the counter, studying the man she had married 15 years earlier with the detached curiosity of someone examining a specimen under laboratory conditions. How unfortunate for them, she replied neutrally. This has gone far enough, Elizabeth, James continued, desperation seeping through his attempt at authoritative displeasure. Whatever point you were trying to make has been made. Now it's time to fix this situation before irreparable damage is done to family relationships. The audacity of his statement, positioning her response as the problem, rather than addressing the betrayal that had necessitated it, confirmed everything Elizabeth had concluded about her marriage during the past 72 hours. James genuinely believed he could orchestrate her humiliation one day and demand her compliance the next, with no meaningful acknowledgement of the breach of trust his actions represented. I've scheduled a meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. at Morgan Hospitality headquarters, she informed him, maintaining the professional tone she reserved for difficult negotiations. Victoria, Harold, Robert, Lauren, and Catherine have all received invitations. I expect everyone to attend. James straightened his legal training, recognizing the significance of this formal approach. A meeting to discuss what exactly? To discuss consequences and resolutions, Elizabeth replied simply. To establish boundaries that should have been clarified years ago. We don't need a formal meeting to resolve a family misunderstanding. James protested, his tone suggesting he recognized control of the situation slipping further from his grasp. We can work through this like adults without corporate theatrics. The time for private resolution passed when you contacted my vendors with fraudulent instructions. Elizabeth countered, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. When you orchestrated my exclusion from an event I funded while keeping my money. When you assassinated my character to justify your betrayal. Tomorrow's meeting isn't a negotiation, James. It's a reckoning. The color drained from his face as he processed not just her words, but the resolute certainty behind them. For perhaps the first time in their marriage, James was confronting the reality that his wife was not the accommodating presence he had comfortably assumed, but a formidable force whose patience he had finally exhausted. You've crossed a line, Elizabeth, he warned, his attorney's instinct for establishing favorable narrative emerging despite his compromised position. Family disagreements happen, but transforming them into business vendettas damages everyone involved. You're overreacting to a simple wedding planning decision. Elizabeth smiled, not the warm expression she had offered during years of accepting minimal recognition, but the cold acknowledgement of an opponent's transparent strategy that her business rivals had learned to fear. A simple wedding planning decision, she repeated the words hanging in the air between them. We'll see if the family maintains that perspective after tomorrow's meeting. She left him in the kitchen with his scotch and rationalizations, retreating to the guest suite she had been occupying since discovering his betrayal. As she prepared for the confrontation that would reshape every relationship in her life, Elizabeth recognized that the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of one wedding celebration, but the future of her marriage and her place within the Henderson family structure. Morning arrived with the clarity that follows definitive decisions. Elizabeth dressed with particular care, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that projected professional authority while remaining appropriately understated. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry minimal but expensive. The presentation of someone who understood that true power requires no ostentatious display. She arrived at Morgan Hospitality headquarters an hour before the scheduled meeting, reviewing the documentation her legal team had prepared and confirming the conference room arrangements. The 40th floor boardroom had been selected specifically for both its commanding views of Phoenix and the subtle intimidation factor of its corporate opulence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic vistas of the city Elizabeth had helped transform through strategic development. The walls displayed the collection of industry awards, acquisition certificates, and architectural renderings that chronicled Morgan Hospitality's rise to regional dominance. The massive conference table, crafted from a single piece of Arizona mesquite and surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, would serve as the stage for revelations that would reshape every relationship in the room. At precisely 9:55 a.m., her assistant announced the arrival of the Henderson family. They had come together, apparently gathering beforehand to present a unified front, a strategy Elizabeth might have admired under different circumstances. Please show them in, she instructed, taking her position at the head of the conference table. They entered with the uncertain steps of people entering unfamiliar territory. None of them had visited Morgan Hospitality's headquarters before, despite Elizabeth's 15 years building the company. Their eyes widened as they absorbed the undeniable evidence of success surrounding them, the tangible manifestation of achievements they had consistently minimized or ignored. James entered first, his usual confident bearing, replaced by the uncertain posture of a man who had discovered that his quiet wife controlled forces beyond his comprehension. His pale complexion and the slight tremor in his hands revealed how thoroughly the recent revelations had shaken his assumptions about domestic power dynamics. Victoria and Harold followed, both carrying the dignified resignation of people preparing to negotiate the best possible terms from a position of unexpected weakness. Victoria's carefully maintained composure showed subtle cracks, The tightness around her eyes, the unusual rigidity in her posture suggesting anxiety she rarely displayed in family gatherings. Robert and Lauren entered next, their expressions reflecting different aspects of the same fundamental realization. Robert's architectural training was evident in how he studied the conference room, taking note of details that spoke to wealth and influence he had never associated with his sister-in-law. Lauren maintained the composed facade she had perfected over recent days, though her wide eyes betrayed growing recognition that she was entering the domain of someone whose power extended far beyond family relationships. Catherine entered last, her face showing the calculation of someone rapidly reassessing long-held assumptions about family hierarchy. The woman who had patronizingly suggested Elizabeth might be grateful for exclusion from wedding obligations now confronted tangible evidence that her sister-in-law operated in spheres of influence she had never bothered to acknowledge or understand. "Thank you all for coming," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying the professional authority that had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. "Please be seated." They arranged themselves around the table with the careful movements of defendants at a trial, instinctively grouping together for mutual protection, while maintaining maximum distance from the woman who had summoned them to this unfamiliar environment. "I believe we have several important matters to discuss regarding recent events and their implications for our family relationships." Elizabeth continued, her tone neutral but resolute. The silence that followed was profound and satisfying. These were the same people who had talked over her at dinner tables for years, dismissing her business opinions while celebrating achievements that paled beside her own accomplishments. Now they sat in her conference room, surrounded by tangible evidence of influence they had never bothered to acknowledge, finally understanding that the quiet family member they had consistently underestimated held absolute power over their immediate situation. Elizabeth placed a leather portfolio on the table before her, opening it with deliberate movements that commanded attention. "Let's begin by establishing some facts that appear to have been overlooked in recent family discussions," she suggested, her tone maintaining professional composure despite the personal nature of the conversation. "3 weeks ago, Victoria approached me regarding financial assistance for Robert and Lauren's wedding. I agreed to contribute $300,000 to provide the celebration they envisioned, with the understanding that my contribution would remain anonymous. This arrangement was made with genuine goodwill and desire to support family happiness." Victoria nodded slightly, her expression suggesting reluctant acknowledgement of this accurate assessment. "Last week," Elizabeth continued, "James contacted multiple vendors associated with the wedding, instructing them to remove me from all guest lists and formal announcements while maintaining existing financial arrangements. He characterized this as a mutual family decision to which I had consented, despite never discussing these changes with me directly." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent, recognizing the futility of denying actions that had been thoroughly documented by the vendors themselves. "When questioned about these instructions," Elizabeth added, her voice cooling slightly, "James informed vendors that my exclusion was necessary due to my emotional instability and tendency to create uncomfortable situations at family gatherings. He suggested my presence would detract from Robert and Lauren's happiness, while assuring vendors that my financial contribution should remain in place." Catherine glanced at James with poorly concealed surprise, suggesting this particular detail had not been shared during family discussions of the wedding arrangements. Subsequent conversations with Victoria, Catherine, and Lauren confirmed that this decision was not James's unilateral action, but represented a coordinated family consensus. "Each of you expressed variations of the same message: my money was welcome, while my presence was problematic." Elizabeth paused, allowing the uncomfortable silence to emphasize the moral bankruptcy of their position before continuing. "What none of you apparently bothered to consider during these family discussions was a rather significant detail about my professional position." She opened a folder and removed a complex organizational chart, sliding it to the center of the conference table. This document outlines Morgan Hospitality Group's corporate structure, with particular emphasis on our events division, luxury venues, catering services, and hotel properties. The Henderson family leaned forward almost in unison, studying the chart with growing comprehension and dismay as the implications became unavoidable. "As you can see," Elizabeth explained with clinical precision, Morgan Hospitality Group owns Evergreen Events, the planning company coordinating Robert and Lauren's wedding. We also own Pinnacle Ridge Estate, the venue you selected for the ceremony. Copper Canyon Catering operates as a subsidiary of our food service division. And Desert Palms Hotel, where you arranged accommodations for out-of-town guests, represents the flagship property in our luxury hotel portfolio. The color drained from Victoria's face as she processed the full scope of their miscalculation. They had excluded the woman who literally owned every component of their celebration while attempting to retain her financial support. In essence, Elizabeth concluded, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had built her business empire. You orchestrated my exclusion from a wedding celebration that would have been impossible without both my money and my corporate infrastructure. You attempted to erase my presence while preserving access to resources that exist only because of my professional success. Robert broke the family's coordinated defense with words that surprised Elizabeth in their directness and apparent sincerity. He stood slowly, looked her directly in the eye, and spoke with the steady voice she remembered from their better family moments before this crisis had revealed everyone's true character. Elizabeth, I want to apologize not just for myself, but for all of us. He began, his acknowledgement carrying genuine remorse rather than strategic contrition. What we did was completely inexcusable. James shot his brother a warning glance that Robert deliberately ignored, continuing with increasing conviction. I should have questioned the decision to exclude you while keeping your financial contribution. I should have recognized that no family harmony could justify treating you with such disrespect. His willingness to accept responsibility while the rest of the family maintained defensive silence revealed character that had been hidden beneath family loyalty and social pressure. Robert's moral courage in this moment planted the first seed of possible redemption, though forgiveness remained a distant consideration rather than an immediate possibility. Robert, your apology is noted, Elizabeth replied with careful neutrality. However, apologies don't address the systematic nature of what occurred or the coordinated deception that multiple family members participated in creating. James finally found his voice, though his words carried the desperate edge of someone whose worldview was crumbling under the weight of evidence and consequences. Elizabeth, you have to understand that we were trying to prevent family drama. He began, his tone betraying the strain of someone attempting to maintain authoritative control while standing on collapsing ground. The exclusion was never meant as an insult. It was meant to protect everyone from uncomfortable situations. Protect everyone from uncomfortable situations by stealing my money and orchestrating my humiliation, Elizabeth asked with the calm precision that had served her through countless business confrontations. James, please explain how theft and betrayal qualify as protective measures. His attempts to minimize the betrayal and rationalize the exclusion became increasingly desperate as he realized that his usual tactics of dismissal and condescension would prove inadequate in this environment. When James finally grasped that his wife controlled not just their personal finances, but an entire regional industry, his defensive anger transformed into bargaining that revealed the depth of his dependence on systems he had never bothered to understand. You're right that the execution was flawed, James admitted with visible reluctance. But the intentions were good. We can fix this situation if everyone just steps back from emotional reactions and focuses on family unity. And the casual characterization of calculated consequences, emotional reactions, demonstrated how completely James misunderstood both the situation and Elizabeth's response to his orchestrated betrayal. He genuinely believed that his wife's exercise of legitimate power represented hysteria that reasonable adults should ignore, rather than recognizing it as the natural result of choices that carried significant consequences. The situation has already been fixed, James, Elizabeth replied, her voice carrying the weight of decisions already implemented rather than possibilities under negotiation. Your brother's wedding was canceled because the family that planned my exclusion discovered they had no alternatives when I withdrew my support. The emotional reactions you reference are the natural response to learning that actions carry consequences. Elizabeth stood and walked to the windows overlooking downtown Phoenix, allowing the silence to emphasize the authority that her position and environment represented. The city stretched below them, much of its hospitality, infrastructure unknowingly controlled by the woman James's family had dismissed as running a small hotel business. However, she continued after this calculated pause, I am prepared to offer terms for resolution that will allow Robert and Lauren to proceed with their celebration, albeit under conditions that reflect the new reality of our family relationships. The room held its collective breath as Elizabeth outlined requirements that would reshape every assumption they had maintained about power, respect, and accountability within their extended family structure. The terms were not negotiation starting points, but non-negotiable conditions that reflected the cost of betraying someone whose influence extended far beyond their comprehension. First, $500,000 payable in advance to cover all wedding expenses, an increase from my original contribution to reflect the additional costs associated with last-minute arrangements. Victoria gasped audibly at the figure, though Harold placed a restraining hand on her arm before she could voice objection. Second, formal written apologies from James, Victoria, Harold, and Catherine acknowledging that your treatment was unacceptable and violated basic standards of family loyalty. James began to protest but fell silent when Elizabeth raised her hand in a gesture that brooked no interruption. Third, public recognition during the wedding reception of what nearly destroyed the celebration and why these events occurred. The guests will understand that this wedding exists only because I chose reconciliation over justified retribution. When the financial requirement represented nearly double the original wedding cost, while the public acknowledgement would ensure that every guest understood the consequences of betraying family members whose generosity had been taken for granted for years. These terms are final and non-negotiable, Elizabeth concluded, returning to her seat at the head of the table. You have 48 hours to decide whether Robert and Lauren will have their wedding under these conditions or whether they will be explaining to 60 guests why there is no celebration at all. The stunned silence that followed suggested the Henderson family was finally beginning to comprehend the consequences of their coordinated betrayal. They had systematically excluded the woman whose success they had minimized for years, only to discover that her power extended far beyond their limited understanding. Robert spoke first, his architectural training evident in his practical approach to problem solving. These terms are harsh, but fair given what we did, he acknowledged, ignoring James's warning glare. I'll need to discuss them with Lauren, but I believe we should accept. This is extortion. James protested, his legal training searching for terminology that might shift moral responsibility from the betrayers to the betrayed. You're using your corporate position to punish family members for a simple misunderstanding. Elizabeth turned to him with the penetrating gaze that had evaluated countless business opponents across similar negotiating tables. No, James, I'm establishing consequences for coordinated betrayal. I'm demonstrating that respect is a non-negotiable component of family relationships. Most importantly, I'm ensuring that this pattern of dismissing my contributions while exploiting my resources ends today. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, her Southern upbringing evident in how she struggled to maintain composure despite the disintegration of her carefully constructed family hierarchy. Elizabeth, surely there's room for compromise here. We're family after all. That designation lost its protective power when you decided I was expendable, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. Family status didn't prevent you from orchestrating my humiliation. It won't shield you from the consequences of that choice. Catherine, who had maintained strategic silence throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke. What happens after the wedding? Where does this leave us as a family? It was the question that hovered beneath the surface of the entire confrontation. Not just the fate of one celebration, but the future of relationships that had been fundamentally altered by revelations of systematic betrayal and previously unacknowledged power dynamics. That depends entirely on what each of you learns from this experience, Elizabeth replied, her tone softening slightly for the first time since the meeting began. Relationships can survive mistakes, even serious ones. What they cannot survive is persistent patterns of disrespect and exploitation. The future of our family connections will be determined by whether this situation represents a turning point or merely a temporary adjustment before returning to established patterns. Elizabeth closed her portfolio with the finality of a judge concluding court proceedings. As I said, you have 48 hours to consider the terms I've outlined. My assistant will show you out. As the Henderson family filed from the conference room with the subdued movements of people who had experienced a seismic shift in their understanding of power dynamics, Elizabeth remained seated, acknowledging the weight of what had transpired. She had not just revealed the extent of her business success, but had fundamentally realigned relationships that had defined much of her adult life. The confrontation had been necessary, not as revenge for a single incident of betrayal, but as correction for patterns that had persisted throughout 15 years of marriage and family integration. The question that remained as she gazed out at the Phoenix skyline her company had helped transform was whether these relationships could be successfully rebuilt on foundations of genuine respect rather than conditional acceptance tied to financial benefit. The 48-hour deadline passed with Robert's acceptance delivered through a formal letter that arrived at Morgan Hospitality precisely at the end of business hours on Wednesday. His handwriting carried the careful precision of an architect who understood that some structures require complete reconstruction rather than simple repairs. The $500,000 appeared in Elizabeth's business account the following morning, accompanied by written apologies from each family member that ranged from Robert's genuinely contrite acknowledgement to James's grudging admission of poor judgment. The stage was set for a wedding that would serve not just as celebration of Robert and Lauren's union, but as public recognition of power dynamics that would never again go unacknowledged within the Henderson family. 4 weeks later, Elizabeth stood in the main hall of Canyon View Resort overseeing final preparations for what had transformed from Robert and Lauren's original vision into something entirely different, yet undeniably beautiful. The venue represented one of Morgan Hospitality's smaller properties nestled against the desert foothills with panoramic mountain views that created natural magnificence no amount of money could purchase or replicate. The guest count had been reduced from 60 to 40, forcing focus on genuine relationships rather than social performance and obligation. Each invitation had been carefully reviewed to ensure that only people who truly mattered to Robert and Lauren would witness their union. The elimination of peripheral guests and acquaintances created an intimacy that the original celebration would never have achieved, despite its greater expense and elaborate planning. Every detail reflected Elizabeth's aesthetic vision rather than the ostentatious display the couple had initially envisioned, with desert wildflowers arranged in understated centerpieces that complemented rather than competed with the natural landscape. The reduced budget had paradoxically produced a more sophisticated celebration, one that emphasized the significance of the commitment being made rather than the wealth being displayed. Elizabeth's assistant approached with the final vendor confirmations, each document bearing the signatures of service providers who now understood they were working directly for Morgan Hospitality rather than through intermediary planners. The shift in their demeanor had been remarkable to observe. Vendors who had treated her with routine professionalism now provided the deference typically reserved for industry leaders whose influence could make or destroy regional businesses. Mrs. Morgan, the catering team has confirmed all final menu adjustments, and the photographer understands that you will be reviewing all images before release. Her assistant reported with the efficiency Elizabeth had come to expect from staff who recognized they worked for someone whose power extended far beyond what most clients could wield. The transformation in how Phoenix's hospitality community regarded Elizabeth had been profound and gratifying. Word had spread throughout the industry about the quiet mogul who had nearly canceled a family wedding over betrayal, with the story growing in dramatic detail through each retelling. Competitors who had underestimated Morgan Hospitality now approached her with the careful respect reserved for forces of nature that could reshape market conditions through single decisions. The incident had elevated Elizabeth's professional reputation from successful businesswoman to industry legend, though the cost in family relationships remained to be determined. Her willingness to exercise power when betrayed had sent clear messages throughout the community about the consequences of crossing Elizabeth Morgan, whether in business dealings or personal relationships. During the cocktail hour before the ceremony, Elizabeth observed Robert moving through the smaller gathering with visible relief rather than the stress that had characterized his behavior during the original planning process. The reduced guest count allowed him to engage meaningfully with each person present, rather than performing social obligations for acquaintances who attended celebrations primarily for networking opportunities. Lauren appeared genuinely radiant in a simpler dress that suited the intimate venue better than the elaborate gown she had originally selected. The woman who had maintained plausible deniability throughout the crisis now carried herself with the careful gratitude of someone who understood that her wedding existed only because of forgiveness she had not necessarily earned, but desperately needed. Victoria approached Elizabeth with the deliberate movement of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Their relationship had been permanently altered by recent events. The matriarch's authority significantly diminished, while her daughter-in-law's power had been irrefutably established. The contrast between Victoria's previous condescension and her current cautious respect created a dynamic Elizabeth was still learning to navigate. "The arrangements are lovely, Elizabeth," Victoria began, her southern accent more pronounced than usual, a stress response Elizabeth had observed whenever her mother-in-law felt socially insecure. "You've created something truly special for Robert and Lauren." "Thank you, Victoria," Elizabeth replied with professional courtesy that neither invited nor rejected closer connection. "I believe celebrations should reflect the genuine relationship being honored, rather than external expectations." Victoria nodded, her hands clutching her champagne flute with unusual tension. "I've been reflecting on our family dynamics these past weeks. There are patterns I failed to recognize or address that contributed to recent unfortunate events." The carefully crafted acknowledgement revealed both progress and limitation. Victoria was acknowledging problems without directly accepting personal responsibility, recognizing issues without apologizing for her specific contributions to them. It represented the cautious first step of someone testing whether reconciliation might be possible without full surrender of long-established hierarchical positions. Recognition of patterns is essential for meaningful change. Elizabeth responded, neither rejecting the olive branch nor fully accepting its limitations. The question remains whether that recognition translates into sustained behavioral adjustments. Before Victoria could formulate a response that balanced her desire for reconciliation with her reluctance to concede matriarchal authority, Robert approached with determination that suggested he had been waiting for an opportunity to speak with Elizabeth privately. "The venue is perfect," he said, gesturing toward the panoramic desert vista that served as backdrop for the outdoor ceremony space. "Better than anything we originally planned. You transformed a disaster into something truly meaningful." Elizabeth studied her brother-in-law with genuine curiosity, recognizing that his response to recent events had consistently differed from the rest of his family. While James, Victoria, and Catherine had remained defensive and reluctant in their acknowledgments, Robert had demonstrated authentic remorse and apparent desire for substantive change. "I'm glad you're pleased with the arrangements," she replied, her tone warming slightly. "Despite everything that happened, I wanted you and Lauren to have a celebration worthy of the commitment you're making." Robert glanced toward his mother, his expression suggesting he had something to say that required privacy. Victoria recognized the silent request and excused herself with the practiced social grace that had defined her interactions for decades, though her departure now carried the uncertainty of someone who no longer controlled family dynamics. "Elizabeth, if I need you to know that I never supported your exclusion from the wedding," Robert began once his mother was out of earshot. "I allowed it to happen by not speaking against it directly, which makes me culpable through silence, if not active participation. But I want to be clear that I never believed you deserved what happened." The distinction he drew between active betrayal and passive acceptance reflected architectural precision. Robert was defining exact boundaries of his responsibility while acknowledging that even passive complicity carried moral weight. His profession had taught him that structural integrity required honest assessment of all supporting elements, including those that might appear secondary to casual observers. "Why didn't you speak up?" Elizabeth asked, genuinely interested in understanding the family dynamics from someone who seemed capable of honest self-reflection. Robert considered the question with a thoughtfulness that characterized his better moments. "Fear, primarily. Not physical fear, but the kind of social anxiety that comes from challenging established family patterns. My entire life has been defined by James setting direction and the rest of us following his lead. Breaking that pattern felt impossible until you forced the issue through your response." His honesty contained uncomfortable truths about both himself and the family structure they had all accepted for decades. James had established himself as the unquestioned authority within Henderson family dynamics, not through particular wisdom or integrity, but through sheer force of personality and unwavering confidence in his own judgment. That authority had remained unchallenged until Elizabeth's systematic dismantling of Robert's wedding had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of following James's leadership without questioning its ethical foundation. And now Elizabeth prompted, curious about how recent events had reshaped his understanding of family relationships. Now I realize that moral courage isn't Inumart isn't optional, Robert replied, his expression reflecting genuine growth rather than strategic positioning. Allowing injustice because confronting it feels uncomfortable isn't passive. It's active reinforcement of harmful patterns. I won't make that mistake again, Elizabeth, with you or anyone else. The sincerity in his statement suggested that the wedding crisis had catalyzed genuine growth rather than merely temporary behavioral adjustment. Robert wasn't simply saying what he believed Elizabeth wanted to hear. He was articulating lessons that would reshape his approach to all relationships moving forward. That's a powerful realization, Elizabeth acknowledged, recognizing the significance of his personal evolution. Not everyone has responded to recent events with the same capacity for honest self-reflection. Robert's gaze shifted toward James, who stood across the courtyard, maintaining careful distance from his wife while performing the social role of proud older brother. The contrast between James's public persona and private behavior remained as stark as ever, though recent events had stripped away the protective veneer that had previously concealed this disparity from family observation. James is struggling, Robert admitted, loyalty to his brother competing with newfound commitment to honesty. His entire understanding of your relationship has been upended. He built his identity around being the successful attorney whose wife had a quaint hospitality business, only to discover that your little hotel hobby dwarfs his professional achievements. It's forcing him to confront assumptions that have defined his self-image for 15 years. Elizabeth considered this assessment, recognizing its accuracy while questioning its implications. Understanding the source of James's behavior doesn't excuse it. Many people face challenges to their self-image without orchestrating betrayals of those closest to them. I'm not suggesting excuses, Robert clarified quickly. Only context. James made choices that reflect significant character flaws. Choices I hope he's capable of recognizing and addressing. But that process requires confronting deeply rooted beliefs about masculinity, success, and relationship dynamics that he's never questioned before. The conversation was interrupted by the wedding planner's discreet signal that the ceremony would begin shortly. Elizabeth and Robert moved toward their designated positions. Their discussion paused but not concluded. The complexity of family reconciliation couldn't be resolved in a single conversation. It would require sustained effort and genuine commitment from all involved parties, with outcomes that remained uncertain despite the celebration currently uniting them. The ceremony itself proved unexpectedly moving. Against the backdrop of desert mountains painted gold by the late afternoon sun, Robert and Lauren exchanged vows that seemed to carry deeper significance given the crisis they had weathered together. Their relationship had been tested before their marriage even began, forcing difficult conversations about loyalty, integrity, and the courage required to challenge family expectations when they conflicted with basic decency. Elizabeth observed James throughout the ceremony, noting the complex emotions that crossed his face as his brother made lifelong commitments before the smaller, more intimate gathering that had replaced their original celebration. The manifestation of Elizabeth's power, both in canceling the wedding and then resurrecting it under her specific conditions, remained unavoidably present in every detail surrounding them. The venue, the catering, the floral arrangements, the photographer discreetly documenting the occasion, all existed through her corporate authority rather than James's family influence. When Robert stood to address the gathering during dinner, his words carried weight that transcended typical wedding reception speeches. The man who had found moral courage to acknowledge wrongdoing continued demonstrating character growth that distinguished him from family members who remained focused on minimizing their accountability. Before Lauren and I exchange our vows, I want to acknowledge someone whose generosity and forgiveness made this celebration possible despite our family's serious failures. Robert began, his voice carrying across the intimate gathering with genuine emotion rather than performed gratitude. Elizabeth Morgan did not just fund our wedding. She preserved our family's integrity when we had abandoned it ourselves. Her willingness to rebuild what we had destroyed through our selfishness and betrayal represents character that we should all aspire to emulate. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine rather than the polite acknowledgement Elizabeth had grown accustomed to at family events. Even guests who had not been privy to the complete story understood that something significant had occurred, that the woman being recognized had demonstrated extraordinary grace under circumstances that would have justified much harsher consequences. Robert continued with specific acknowledgement of Elizabeth's sacrifice and character that represented public vindication she had never demanded, but had always deserved. Elizabeth taught us that real strength isn't about dominating others, but about using power responsibly when others fail to show basic respect and decency. Lauren stood from the head table, her eyes bright with emotion that appeared genuine rather than strategic. The bride who would build her marriage on the foundation of Elizabeth's forgiveness finally seemed to understand the gravity of what her family had nearly destroyed through their calculated betrayal. "I want to publicly apologize for our family's treatment of Elizabeth." Lauren said, her voice carrying enough emotional weight to suggest authentic learning rather than performed contrition. "We responded to extraordinary generosity with disrespect and betrayal. We accepted her money while excluding her presence, which represents a moral failure that I will remember for the rest of my life." Her admission of family accountability in front of wedding guests created the public recognition of wrongdoing that private apologies could never have achieved. The woman who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the crisis was finally acknowledging the ethical bankruptcy of their coordinated exclusion while accepting Elizabeth's funding. "Elizabeth did not just save our wedding," Lauren continued, tears now visible on her face. "She taught us about treating people with the dignity they deserve, regardless of whether they can benefit us. I hope that our marriage will demonstrate the kind of integrity and loyalty that she has shown to our family, despite having every reason to abandon us completely." As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself genuinely enjoying the celebration for the first time in recent memory. The intimate gathering allowed for meaningful conversations, rather than superficial social interactions, while the knowledge that every detail existed on her terms created satisfaction that mere attendance could never have provided. James remained notably subdued throughout the evening, his usual dominant personality replaced by the careful behavior of someone who had learned that his assumptions about family power dynamics required fundamental revision. The man who had dismissed Elizabeth's achievements for 15 years now moved through her rebuilt celebration with the recognition that his wife controlled forces he had never bothered to understand or respect. The mountain sunset created a natural backdrop for Robert and Lauren's first dance, painting the desert sky in colors that no decorator could replicate or improve upon. The celebration was beautiful, elegant, and meaningful in ways that their original plans would never have achieved, despite costing nearly double and requiring public acknowledgement of family failures that would be remembered long after the dancing ended. Elizabeth slipped away from the reception shortly after the cake cutting, preferring solitude to continued navigation of family interactions that remained charged with unresolved tensions. She walked to a private terrace overlooking the illuminated resort grounds, the distant sound of music and celebration providing counterpoint to her reflections on recent events and their implications for her future. Marcus found her there, approaching with the respectful awareness of personal boundaries that had characterized their professional relationship for over a decade. "Beautiful evening," he remarked, joining her at the stone railing, without presuming closer proximity than their established patterns warranted. "The wedding turned out well," Elizabeth agreed, her attention focused on the desert landscape stretching toward mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "Better than their original plans in many respects." "That seems to be a theme recently," Marcus observed with characteristic perceptiveness. "Difficult circumstances producing unexpected improvements. The Henderson family is learning what the business community discovered years ago. Underestimating Elizabeth Morgan inevitably leads to revelations about power they failed to recognize until too late." His assessment carried professional admiration untainted by the personal complications that had characterized family responses to Elizabeth's demonstrated influence. Marcus had always recognized her capabilities, appreciating her strategic thinking and decisive leadership, without feeling threatened by her success or attempting to minimize her achievements. "The business community adapts more readily than family," Elizabeth replied after considering his comparison. "Professional relationships are governed by rational assessment of capabilities and results. Personal connections involve emotional investments that complicate objective evaluation." Marcus nodded, his expression suggesting deeper understanding of her meaning than her words alone conveyed. "And how are you adapting to your revised personal landscape? The Henderson family has experienced dramatic restructuring, but you've undergone equally significant changes in how you navigate those relationships. The question invited reflection. Elizabeth had been avoiding focusing instead on practical arrangements and professional implications, rather than examining the emotional impact of recent events on her own sense of identity and connection. The systematic betrayal by James and his family had not just revealed their character limitations, but had forced fundamental reconsideration of her approach to relationships that had defined much of her adult life. I'm still determining appropriate boundaries. She admitted, the honesty feeling both uncomfortable and necessary. For 15 years, I accepted patterns that shouldn't have been acceptable. Establishing healthier expectations requires sustained effort rather than single dramatic gestures. And James Marcus asked the question, carrying no judgment or expectation, merely recognition that her marriage represented the most complicated relationship requiring reassessment. Elizabeth sighed, the sound carrying 15 years of accumulated compromises and diminished expectations. James is attempting to salvage what he believes we had before, not understanding that what we had before is precisely what needed changing. He's apologizing for specific actions while defending the underlying assumptions that made those actions possible. Her assessment revealed the fundamental challenge that threatened their marriage's survival. James remained focused on the wedding incident as an isolated error in judgment, rather than recognizing it as the inevitable manifestation of patterns that had characterized their entire relationship. His apologies addressed symptoms while defending the disease that had produced them. Can the relationship survive that kind of fundamental disconnect? Marcus asked, his tone suggesting genuine concern rather than personal agenda. I don't know, Elizabeth admitted, the uncertainty both frightening and strangely liberating. 15 years represents significant investment, but continuing to accept diminishment isn't a viable option regardless of relationship longevity. James needs to decide whether he wants a partnership based on mutual respect or whether he requires a relationship dynamic that preserves his sense of superiority. I can't make that choice for him. The conversation paused as fireworks illuminated the sky above the resort, the display Elizabeth had arranged as surprise celebration for Robert and Lauren's wedding. The bursts of color reflected in her eyes as she contemplated the symbolism, beauty emerging from explosive force transformation, requiring destruction of what came before brilliance, visible only against darkness. Whatever you decide, Marcus said quietly as the final display faded into desert darkness. Remember that your value extends far beyond any single relationship. The Elizabeth Morgan who built an empire from nothing, who commands respect throughout an entire industry, who demonstrates integrity even when betrayed. That woman deserves relationships that honor her worth rather than diminishing it through constant accommodation. His words carried no romantic undertones or inappropriate suggestions, only the honest assessment of someone who had witnessed her extraordinary capabilities for years and recognized the disparity between her professional respect and personal treatment. Marcus wasn't positioning himself as alternative to James, but reminding Elizabeth of standards she should require in any relationship, regardless of who provided it. Thank you, Marcus, she replied, genuine appreciation evident in her voice. For perspective that doesn't require emotional performance or strategic positioning. It's unfortunately rare in both professional and personal contexts. Their conversations shifted to business matters, the upcoming Las Vegas expansion, and potential acquisition opportunities in Northern California, providing comfortable territory after more challenging personal reflections. By the time Elizabeth returned to the reception, her composure had been restored through discussion of subjects where her confidence remained unshaken despite recent emotional turbulence. The following morning, Elizabeth awoke in her suite at Canyon View Resort, having chosen to remain overnight rather than returning to the home she still technically shared with James, though had not occupied for several weeks. The separate accommodations provided necessary distance for reflection about relationship possibilities moving forward, allowing evaluation uncomplicated by daily proximity and established patterns. She had just finished her morning coffee when her phone displayed an incoming call from Robert. Answering with mild curiosity about what might prompt communication so soon after the wedding, Elizabeth was surprised by the serious tone that greeted her. Elizabeth, I wanted to call before you hear this from someone else. James came to my room late last night after most guests had departed. He was emotional and made some statements I believe you should know about. The careful phrasing suggested information that required delicate handling rather than casual conversation. Elizabeth appreciated Robert's consideration in providing direct communication rather than allowing rumors or secondhand reports to reach her through other channels. What kind of statements, she asked, mentally preparing for various possibilities, given James's recent behavior patterns. He expressed feeling humiliated by the public acknowledgments during the reception. Robert began his tone suggesting he was selecting words with architectural precision. He characterized your insistence on those statements as deliberately designed to diminish him before family and friends. Elizabeth processed this information without surprise, recognizing the consistent pattern in James's response to recent events. He remained focused on perceived damage to his reputation rather than acknowledging the legitimacy of consequences that followed his orchestrated betrayal. His concerns centered on how he appeared to others rather than how his actions had affected his wife. Did he express any recognition that those public statements addressed actual wrongdoing rather than manufactured grievances? Elizabeth asked, though she anticipated the answer. No, Robert admitted after brief hesitation. He focused entirely on the impact to his standing within family and social circles, not on whether the content of those statements was accurate or deserved. The confirmation matched Elizabeth's expectations while reinforcing her concerns about James's capacity for meaningful change. His objection addressed embarrassment rather than ethics, focusing on consequences to his reputation rather than examination of choices that had necessitated public accountability. There's something else, Robert continued, obvious discomfort evident in his voice. James made some comments about your business success being luck rather than skill, suggesting anyone could have achieved similar results with the same market conditions and opportunities. The attempted diminishment of her professional accomplishments revealed James's continued inability to acknowledge Elizabeth's capabilities without qualification or minimization. Even after irrefutable demonstration of her business acumen and industry influence, he remained committed to narratives that preserved his sense of superiority by attributing her success to factors beyond personal capability. That's consistent with his perspective throughout our marriage. Elizabeth observed the pattern too established to provoke fresh hurt. James has always needed explanations for my success that don't require acknowledging my strategic vision or leadership capabilities. I challenged him on those statements, Robert added, surprising Elizabeth with this evidence of continued moral courage rather than reversion to established family dynamics. I pointed out that thousands of people had the same market access and opportunities, yet only you built a $500 million hospitality empire while maintaining the integrity that distinguishes Morgan Properties from competitors. The unexpected advocacy touched Elizabeth more deeply than she had anticipated. After 15 years of family gatherings where her achievements were systematically minimized or ignored, Robert's willingness to directly challenge his brother's dismissive characterization represented meaningful change rather than temporary adjustment to recent power revelations. Thank you for that, she said quietly, genuine appreciation evident in her voice. Not just for the defense itself, but for recognizing the importance of speaking truth even when family loyalty might suggest otherwise. I meant what I said at the reception, Robert replied with equal sincerity. Your response to our betrayal taught me about integrity and responsible use of power. The least I can do is apply those lessons consistently rather than reverting to comfortable patterns when they become inconvenient. His commitment to sustained change rather than temporary behavioral adjustment suggested possibility for genuine relationship evolution that Elizabeth had not necessarily expected from any Henderson family member. Robert appeared to be integrating recent experiences into fundamental character development rather than viewing them as isolated incidents requiring specific accommodation before returning to established patterns. How did James respond to your challenge? Elizabeth asked, curious about whether Robert's intervention had produced any meaningful reflection. Not well, Robert admitted with audible resignation. He accused me of betraying family loyalty and suggested I was performing for potential business advantage, given your obvious influence in the industry. He couldn't conceive of me defending you because I genuinely believed you deserved defense. The response revealed James's continued inability to recognize authentic moral principle as motivation for behavior that contradicted his preferred family narrative. He remained committed to interpretations that preserved his central authority within family dynamics, even when those interpretations required attributing calculated self-interest to expressions of basic decency. "I'm sorry that supporting me has created tension with your brother," Elizabeth said, genuinely concerned about the potential cost Robert might pay for his evolving perspective on family relationships. "Don't apologize for that," Robert countered, with unexpected firmness. "The tension exists because James refuses to acknowledge harmful patterns that have persisted for decades. If preserving his comfort requires perpetuating those patterns, then discomfort becomes necessary for genuine growth. You didn't create this situation, Elizabeth. You simply forced us to confront what we've been carefully avoiding through coordinated denial." His mature understanding of responsibility allocation contrasted sharply with James's persistent victim positioning. While James characterized Elizabeth's response to betrayal as creating unnecessary family drama, Robert recognized that addressing long-established dysfunction necessarily involved disrupting comfortable patterns that had enabled problematic behavior. Their conversation concluded with Robert expressing hope that Elizabeth would consider maintaining closer connection with him and Lauren, regardless of how her relationship with James evolved. The invitation represented significant departure from previous family dynamics, where relationships with individual Henderson members had been mediated through James's central position rather than existing independently of his involvement or approval. Elizabeth returned to her Phoenix condominium that afternoon, the luxury high-rise she had purchased years earlier as occasional retreat from suburban domesticity, now serving as primary residence, while she evaluated her marriage's future prospects. The space reflected her aesthetic preferences without compromise or accommodation, surroundings that honored her accomplishments through displayed industry awards and art collected during international business travel. James arrived unannounced that evening, his appearance at her door combining assumed entitlement with visible uncertainty, the paradoxical approach of someone who believed access remained his right, while recognizing that previous assumptions no longer applied without question. Elizabeth admitted him with neither enthusiasm nor hostility, maintaining the careful neutrality that had characterized their limited interactions since the wedding crisis erupted. "We need to talk," James began without preamble, his attorney's instinct for establishing conversational direction evident despite his compromised position. "This separation has gone on long enough. It's time to determine whether we're salvaging this marriage or ending it." The binary framing revealed his continued preference for definitive outcomes rather than complex process exploration. James approached relationship healing as he did legal negotiations, seeking efficient resolution that established clear parameters rather than embracing the messy, nonlinear nature of genuine reconciliation. That determination depends on whether fundamental issues can be addressed or whether they represent irreconcilable differences, Elizabeth replied, matching his directness while avoiding his oversimplification. Resuming cohabitation without addressing underlying patterns would simply postpone inevitable recurrence of similar problems. James's expression reflected momentary surprise at her unwillingness to accept his framing, followed by the practiced recalibration that served him well in courtroom adjustments when initial approaches proved ineffective. "I've acknowledged my mistakes regarding the wedding situation. I've apologized both privately and publicly as you required. What more do you need before we can move forward?" His response revealed the continued gap in their understanding of recent events and their significance. James characterized the wedding exclusion as isolated mistake requiring specific correction rather than recognizing it as manifestation of relationship patterns that demanded fundamental reconsideration. "This isn't about the wedding specifically," Elizabeth explained with the patience she might employ when explaining complex business concepts to new employees. "The wedding situation revealed patterns that have characterized our entire marriage. My contributions minimized while expected. My presence tolerated rather than valued, my success explained away rather than celebrated. Addressing a single incident doesn't resolve the underlying dynamics that made it possible." James paced across her living room, frustration evident in his movements as he confronted expectations that exceeded his anticipated requirements for reconciliation. He had prepared for negotiation regarding specific behaviors rather than fundamental relationship restructuring, for concrete actions rather than value reassessment. So what exactly are you asking for? He demanded, attorney instincts, seeking definable terms rather than conceptual shifts. Give me specific changes you need to see, and I'll determine whether they're reasonable accommodations or excessive demands. The framing itself revealed persistent problems, positioning Elizabeth's basic expectations for respect and recognition as potential excessive demands, requiring his evaluation rather than reasonable standards any healthy relationship should provide. James continued approaching their marriage as negotiation between opposing interests rather than partnership with shared values and mutual investment. I'm asking for recognition as equal partner rather than subordinate contributor. Elizabeth replied, refusing his attempt to reduce fundamental dynamics to itemized behaviors. For acknowledgement of my capabilities without qualification or minimization. For celebration of my success without resentment or competitive comparison. For inclusion based on inherent value rather than conditional utility. James appeared genuinely puzzled by these requests, his expressions suggesting he struggled to translate conceptual expectations into actionable obligations. Those sound like feelings rather than behaviors, he objected, revealing his continued preference for measurable compliance over meaningful change. How would I demonstrate those things in ways you'd consider sufficient? The question itself demonstrated the challenge facing their relationship's survival. James sought formula for performing reconciliation rather than understanding the fundamental shifts in perception and valuation required for genuine healing. He wanted checklists for required actions rather than engaging the deeper work of examining assumptions and biases that had shaped his approach to their marriage for 15 years. That's precisely the problem, Elizabeth observed with growing certainty about their irreconcilable differences. You're approaching our relationship as performance requiring script rather than partnership requiring authentic recognition. The behaviors would emerge naturally from genuine valuation, not from calculated compliance with specified requirements. James's frustration visibly increased as he confronted relationship expectations that resisted his preferred approach to conflict resolution. His legal training had equipped him for adversarial negotiation with clear parameters and definitive outcomes, not the ambiguous territory of emotional authenticity and value reassessment. This is completely impractical, he protested, retreating to familiar criticism when faced with challenges that exceeded his established capabilities. You're expecting mind reading rather than providing actionable guidelines. How can I meet expectations you refuse to define in measurable terms? Elizabeth considered his objection, recognizing the genuine confusion beneath his defensive posturing. James wasn't simply resisting reasonable requests, but genuinely struggling to comprehend relationship paradigms that didn't conform to his transactional understanding of human interaction. He truly believed that authentic connection could be reduced to performance metrics and behavioral compliance rather than emerging from fundamental valuation and genuine respect. I'm not expecting mind reading, she clarified, with unexpected compassion for his limitations. I'm expecting relationship investment that produces natural recognition of my worth, rather than calculated performance of specified behaviors. The difference isn't semantic, it's fundamental to whether genuine connection is possible between us. The silence that followed suggested James was finally confronting the magnitude of change required for their marriage's survival. His expression reflected genuine struggle between preserving comfortable patterns that had defined his identity for 15 years and embracing transformative growth that challenged his fundamental understanding of relationship dynamics. I don't know if I can be who you need, he admitted finally, vulnerability replacing his usual authoritative certainty. Not because I don't want our marriage to continue, but because I'm not sure I know how to value someone without measuring their utility or comparing their achievements to my own. That's been my approach to every relationship throughout my life. The unexpected honesty represented the first genuine communication they had shared since the wedding crisis began. James wasn't defending his behavior or minimizing its impact, but acknowledging fundamental limitations in his capacity for the relationship Elizabeth deserved. The admission reflected greater self-awareness than she had anticipated, though it simultaneously confirmed her growing certainty about their irreconcilable differences. I appreciate your honesty, Elizabeth replied, genuine respect evident in her tone, despite the painful implications of his admission. It's more valuable than continued promises for change that doesn't address fundamental limitations. "So this is it?" James asked, gesturing between them to encompass 15 years of shared history and accumulated connection. "We're just done and everything we've built together discarded because I made one serious mistake." His framing revealed continued inability to recognize the wedding incident as manifestation, rather than isolated error as revelation of established patterns, rather than unprecedented deviation from otherwise healthy dynamics. Even in apparent acceptance of relationship conclusion, James remained committed to narratives that minimized his responsibility while maximizing Elizabeth's reaction. "We're acknowledging that what we built wasn't actually what either of us thought we were creating," Elizabeth corrected, gently refusing his attempt to characterize thoughtful evaluation as impulsive abandonment. "You believed you were building a marriage with supportive wife whose modest success complemented your central achievements. I believed I was building partnership that would eventually recognize my contributions when properly demonstrated. We were constructing entirely different relationships while occupying the same marriage." The architectural metaphor resonated with something in James's legal mind, his expression suggesting reluctant recognition of the fundamental disconnect she had identified. They had indeed been building different structures while using the same materials, creating frameworks that could not be reconciled without complete dismantling and reconstruction. "I did love you," he offered quietly, the past tense perhaps unconscious, but nonetheless revealing, "in the only way I knew how." "I know," Elizabeth acknowledged genuine sadness, coloring her response despite her certainty about necessary separation. "But that way was never going to be enough for either of us to thrive. You need someone who accepts the relationship dynamics you're capable of providing. I need someone who recognizes my worth without requiring constant proof or explanation." The resignation in James's expression suggested growing acceptance that their marriage had reached its natural conclusion rather than temporary interruption. He gathered his coat with the careful movements of someone recognizing the finality of a departure, understanding that this conversation represented conclusion rather than negotiation phase. "I'll have my attorney contact yours regarding division of assets," he said, professional demeanor, providing comfortable retreat from emotional territory that exceeded his comfortable navigation. "Though given recent revelations about your financial position, I assume you'll be generous in settlement terms." The comment revealed that even in acceptance of marriage dissolution, James remained focused on material considerations rather than emotional impact on financial arrangements, rather than personal growth opportunities. His primary concern centered on settlement terms rather than understanding the relationship lessons that might prevent similar patterns in future connections. "The settlement will be fair," Elizabeth assured him, refusing engagement with implied expectations of punitive financial concessions. "Neither excessive nor insufficient, but reflecting equitable distribution of shared assets and appropriate recognition of individual contributions." James nodded, accepting her parameters with the resignation of someone recognizing limited negotiation leverage. "I suppose that's all anyone can reasonably expect," he acknowledged, though his tone suggested continued belief that his position warranted special consideration, despite recent revelations about relationship dynamics. After he departed, Elizabeth remained in her living room contemplating the conversation that had effectively concluded 15 years of marriage. The finality brought neither triumph nor devastation, but quiet certainty that necessary boundaries had finally been established after decades of excessive accommodation. The relationship had reached its natural conclusion when its fundamental limitations could no longer be disguised through strategic compromises or hopeful projections. 3 months later, Elizabeth presided over the grand opening of Morgan Hospitality's newest luxury property in Las Vegas, the $75 million acquisition that had received unanimous board approval just before the wedding crisis erupted. The gleaming hotel tower represented another milestone in her company's continued expansion, its sophisticated design and impeccable service standards establishing new benchmarks for the competitive Vegas luxury market. The event attracted industry leaders, financial reporters, and government officials eager to associate with Morgan Hospitality's growing influence and uncompromising quality standards. Elizabeth moved through the celebration with the quiet confidence that had become her professional trademark, engaging guests with genuine interest while maintaining the understated authority that commanded respect without requiring ostentatious display. Marcus approached as she concluded conversation with Nevada's lieutenant governor, offering champagne with the casual efficiency that characterized their comfortable professional partnership. "Congratulations," he said simply, genuine admiration evident in his expression. "The property exceeds even your original vision. The design team deserves primary credit," Elizabeth replied with characteristic deflection of personal praise to team accomplishment. They translated conceptual direction into practical implementation that honored the original vision while adapting to discovered challenges. "The vision preceded the team," Marcus countered with gentle insistence on proper credit allocation. "Your strategic foresight in acquiring this property when others dismissed its potential created the opportunity that talented people could subsequently develop." Elizabeth accepted the acknowledgement with quiet grace, her capacity for receiving appropriate recognition having increased significantly since establishing healthier relationship boundaries. The months following her separation from James had brought unexpected personal growth alongside continued professional success, her confidence expanding as systematic diminishment gave way to genuine appreciation from both colleagues and family members capable of authentic connection. "Have you heard from the Hendersons recently?" Marcus asked, transitioning to personal matters with the careful respect for boundaries that characterized their evolving relationship. The months following Elizabeth's separation had brought gradual adjustment in their professional partnership, incorporating greater personal connection while maintaining appropriate distinction between business collaboration and private relationship development. "Robert and Lauren visit regularly," Elizabeth replied, genuine warmth evident when discussing her former brother-in-law and his wife. "They're expecting their first child in June. Apparently, my wedding gift included unexpected family expansion timing." The couple had maintained consistent connection despite the marriage dissolution, their relationship with Elizabeth strengthening rather than diminishing as they demonstrated continued commitment to the personal growth catalyzed by the wedding crisis. Their regular dinner visits and weekend hiking excursions represented relationship based on genuine appreciation rather than family obligation connection that honored Elizabeth's worth rather than exploiting her resources. "And the others," Marcus inquired with careful neutrality that acknowledged the topic's sensitivity without avoiding necessary conversation. "James finalized the divorce settlement last month," Elizabeth responded, her tone reflecting neither lingering resentment nor nostalgic attachment, but simple acknowledgement of necessary transition. "He's accepted partnership with a Los Angeles firm specializing in entertainment law. Fresh start in new territory, which seems appropriate for everyone involved." The separation had concluded with surprising efficiency once James accepted its inevitability, his legal training facilitating practical arrangements once emotional resistance gave way to pragmatic acceptance. The settlement had been equitable rather than punitive, reflecting Elizabeth's commitment to fairness rather than retribution, despite the betrayal that had catalyzed their separation. "Victoria calls occasionally," she continued, acknowledging the unexpected development in her relationship with her former mother-in-law. "Mostly social check-ins rather than substantive connection, but the effort itself represents significant evolution given our previous dynamics." The matriarch's cautious outreach reflected both limitation and progress. Victoria remained incapable of directly acknowledging her role in established family patterns, but demonstrated genuine desire for continued connection despite the marriage dissolution that would traditionally have terminated such relationships. Her careful conversations focused primarily on social pleasantries and family updates, but the consistent effort itself represented recognition of Elizabeth's value beyond her status as James's wife. "And how are you navigating all these relationship adjustments?" Marcus asked with genuine interest rather than polite conversation obligation. "The professional achievements are evident to everyone present, but personal evolution often proceeds with less visible markers." Elizabeth considered his question with characteristic thoughtfulness, appreciating his recognition that success encompassed multiple dimensions beyond professional accomplishment. "I'm learning that boundaries aren't selfish but necessary for authentic connection," she replied after careful consideration. "That relationships requiring constant diminishment of self aren't actually relationships worth preserving." Marcus nodded, understanding the hard-won wisdom her response represented. "Those lessons rarely come without significant cost, but their value generally exceeds the price of acquisition." The cost was necessary, Elizabeth acknowledged without regret, despite acknowledging the pain involved in relationship dissolution. Continuing patterns of accommodation would have eventually required complete surrender of authentic self, which represents unacceptable exchange, regardless of relationship longevity or social expectations. Their conversation paused as Elizabeth was called away for photographs with city officials and industry leaders celebrating the property opening. The professional obligations provided natural transition from personal matters to public responsibilities, maintaining appropriate boundaries, while acknowledging the increasing integration of personal connection within their established professional relationship. Later that evening, Elizabeth stood on the private balcony of the presidential suite, surveying the Las Vegas skyline with its spectacular illumination against the desert night. The panoramic view provided perfect metaphor for her current perspective, elevated vantage point offering comprehensive understanding of landscape that appeared entirely different when viewed from ground-level immersion. The past year had brought painful revelations alongside necessary growth, systematic betrayal alongside liberating boundary establishment. The wedding crisis had forced confrontation with relationship patterns that had persisted throughout 15 years of marriage, catalyzing changes that might never have occurred without the dramatic exposure of previously disguised dynamics. Elizabeth's phone chimed with incoming message from Robert, the ultrasound image of his unborn child accompanied by text expressing gratitude for her continued presence in their lives, despite the family complications that might have justified complete separation. The genuine connection represented unexpected gift emerging from painful circumstances. Relationship based on authentic appreciation rather than obligation or utility. The desert breeze carried faint music from the celebration, continuing 40 floors below, industry leaders and government officials, networking within the newest jewel in Morgan Hospitality's expanding portfolio. The professional success represented validation of Elizabeth's strategic vision and leadership capabilities, external confirmation of qualities her marriage had consistently minimized or dismissed throughout its 15-year duration. Marcus joined her on the balcony, respecting her solitude with quiet presence that offered companionship without demanding engagement. Their evolving relationship proceeded at careful pace that honored both professional partnership and growing personal connection, maintaining appropriate boundaries while acknowledging potential for deeper relationship development when timing proved appropriate for both parties. Quite a view, he observed, standing beside her with comfortable proximity that neither presumed nor avoided potential connection. Worth every challenge required for its acquisition. Elizabeth replied, the statement encompassing both the property below and the personal growth that had accompanied recent months of difficult transition and necessary boundary establishment. The desert stretched beyond the city lights, vast landscape representing unlimited possibility rather than intimidating emptiness. Elizabeth Morgan had emerged from 15 years of systematic diminishment with clearer understanding of both her professional capabilities and personal worth, with established boundaries that would prevent future relationships from repeating patterns that had characterized her marriage. The quiet empress had always existed within Morgan Hospitality's expanding empire and her carefully constructed professional relationships. She had simply required the right circumstances to emerge from behind the accommodating persona maintained during decades of prioritizing family harmony over personal recognition. Those circumstances had arrived through James's betrayal and his family's coordinated cruelty, creating catalysts necessary for relationships and reputations to align with realities carefully concealed behind quiet generosity and patient support for people who had never deserved such consideration. The desert sunset painted Elizabeth's balcony with colors money couldn't purchase, while illuminating future that finally reflected her actual capabilities, rather than others' limited expectations of what the quiet woman might achieve when she stopped accepting less than she deserved.